Yes, I think it says starting recording.
Okay, perfect. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of What Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And I'm very excited with the guest we have today or tonight, depending where you are. We have Greta Zarro, who is the organizing director for World Beyond War, which is brilliant, peace organization. And I've had David Swanson, who's a member of the organization, on 3 times now, and of course I've done events with your organization about ending the Western Gulf War on Syria, and yeah, we're going to be talking about a whole bunch of stuff. But just before I introduce Greta formally, I just wanted anyone who's based in anyone who's based in Canada, if you're voting today in the provincial elections, please vote for my friend Jennifer Moxon of the Communist Party of Canada. And you do not have to feel bad for voting for her, because the NDP Socialist Caucus isn't running anyone, and none of the Greens are like Miriam Haddad or Dimitri Lascaris. And then another thing, a past guest of mine, Fiona Sim, who's based in England, was the victim of a xenophobic hate crime. I'll put the links to where people can donate to the petition calling for justice and helping her and her family recover from an arson attack that happened. So yeah, unbelievable, but that's what happens with the state of war and ridiculous nationalism. And so yeah, so first of all, Greta, thank you for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's a real honor to have you, and also and Greta. Yeah, just before I also ask my first question, I know that you're the organizing director for World Beyond War. But talk to the viewers about this garden that you do in upstate New York, because I think people would be interested in that.
Yeah, so I kind of wear these two hats. I work, as Youri said, as organizing director with World Beyond War, and then I'm also a member of Unadilla Community Farm, which is in upstate New York in the United States. And we are a nonprofit farm education center. Our mission is to provide a space for the teaching and practice of sustainable skills. And we have two main programs, one of which is we train youth who come on the farm and live with us for an immersive program, and they learn different skills related to sustainable agriculture, natural building, plant-based cooking, and things like that. And then we also run a veggie box program. As we're kind of training people and learning these skills, we're also producing fruits and vegetables. And so then we donate those to food banks in the region. And also we have a sliding scale program where families can pay whatever they can afford, and we deliver it to people's doorsteps. So that's kind of my other job outside of World Beyond War. And for me, I see both of these things as very interconnected, to be doing the policy advocacy, grassroots organizing work, and calling on our elected officials to make these changes to the system, but also to literally be on the ground and doing, the on the ground work of building the alternative world that we want to see.
Oh, perfect. And actually, I'm gonna switch my questions a little bit around. I wanted to talk to you about the very thorny issue of Ukraine, but actually, just before, but before we talk about that, because of what you just mentioned, and I know that you also worked before with the New York branch of Food and Water Watch, right?
Yes.
Okay, so then can you, explain how if one is an environmentalist, and of course everyone should be an environmentalist, but if one's an environmentalist and an eco-socialist, why you cannot support any kind of militarism, whether it's the pivot to Asia, whether it's spending money on fighter jets, whether it's NATO and countries spending 2% of their GDP, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it actually is a lot on militarism, and why yeah, if you're an environmentalist, why you should be opposed to, all forms of militarism and militarism's contributions to the ongoing climate crisis.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I started my organizing career working for Food and Water Watch, and I didn't really know about war issues and anti-war issues. That was very outside of the scope of my work, and it wasn't something, we didn't connect the dots. It wasn't something that we worked on. We were focused more on food and water issues and the corporate control of our resources. And then I ended up taking the job with World Beyond War because I wanted to move to the farm and I wanted to do something remote. And with World Beyond War, I can work totally remotely. And so it was really a new thing for me to delve into anti-war organizing. And immediately I started seeing the cross connections that you just mentioned. And that's what we try to do at World Beyond War, is to build an intersectional movement and to connect the dots and get out of our silos. And we have different fact sheets and webinars that talk about these intersections and trying to make connections with different groups and find that commonality. As you said, war is a leading cause of climate chaos. The U.S. military, for example, is the #1 institutional consumer of oil on the planet, which is mind-boggling. So there's lots of intersections, and unfortunately, we don't necessarily see environmental groups always making that leap and making those connections. And I think it's because, people are so overwhelmed with all of these issues that we're grappling with. And you, in some ways, from a strategic perspective, you have to kind of hone in and focus on a singular campaign to focus your energies. But that's part of our work at World Beyond War, is to kind of broaden that conversation and build those intersections.
And of course, the wars are often for fossil fuels and for, extracting the Earth's finite resources. So that's another reason why people, should be opposed to wars, because all the wars for oil, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's, Iraq or Libya, so not only does the military inflame the climate crisis, but because all of those wars are for, the extraction of other people's resources, and not even ecologically friendly resources. That's just another reason why the green movement and the peace movement needs to, merge together and say, no wars, not ever, right?
Right. Yeah. And there's so many facets of it too. I mean, of course, another argument is the economic argument. And we have fact sheets that talk about we need $2 trillion a year for other things. And $2 trillion a year is what the world spends globally on militarism. And so, I mean, that's like a common argument, right? When progressives are advocating for, a just transition away from fossil fuels, for healthcare, for education, et cetera, this common kind of pushback is, well, how are you going to pay for it? And so anti-war organizations like World Beyond War come in and say, well, we actually we know where the money is. It's all in militarism. And again, that's not necessarily talked about. It's this kind of elephant in the room. It's this huge thing that no one's talking about. And the fact that almost, 50% of discretionary tax dollars in the U.S. are spent on militarism. So that is part of the argument too. Basically, if you want free healthcare, if you want free education, if you want, the end to climate change, then you should also be advocating for reducing military budgets. And then another piece of it too, there's this argument that militarism is protecting us, quote unquote. And then when we look at the environmental impact too, it's coming back to the U.S. as well. So, for example, the U.S. has all of these military bases domestically and abroad. And in the U.S. military is the third largest polluter of U.S. waterways. So we're actually fouling our own nest. We're polluting our own waterways from this military that's supposedly supposed to be protecting us.
Unbelievable. And that's actually, before I get to my second question, what would you say to militarists or those who think that we do need wars because they say that there are such things as good wars? What would you say to those saying that we can still have universal health care, pharmacare, we can merge mental health care with a single payer system, and we can alleviate and we can also alleviate domestic policy and still keep the military budget, because and they'll use the example of how FDR he gave us like full employment, he got us out of the Great Depression because he got everyone a job working and joining World War II, and got cars to make tanks and stuff like that.
Right. Well, there's actually research that shows that jobs outside of the military would create more jobs for the same amount of money, would create more jobs. And so there is actually data that kind of counters that argument. That is, as you said, a very common narrative of what about the jobs? What about the jobs? But there's actually data showing that the money would be better invested in other industries like education and healthcare, et cetera. Yeah, and of course, we do have to acknowledge that a lot of people are being employed by the defense industry, and across the United States. That's part of the strategy of the defense industry, is that there are military facilities in every congressional district. So every Congress member has a stake in supporting militarism because their constituents are working for the military, and that was purposely done to put these facilities in every congressional district. So we do, we can't just sort of brush that aside. Like, there is a necessary discussion here about a just transition, and there are various groups that we work with, like Labor Against the Arms Trade, which is based in Canada, which is working with the unions and working with labor and having these conversations and thinking about, how can we do this in a just way? And there needs to be government support to support this transition. And this is actually something that we'll be talking about at our upcoming annual conference, which is about resistance and regeneration. That regeneration piece, part of that is the just transition, and we'll have a whole panel with experts from around the world dissecting this exact issue and talking about different successful models that have happened of weapons companies that have transitioned. And we saw that in the pandemic with several companies that started using the same facilities to create ventilators, for example. So we know it is possible. There just needs to be the political will.
In fact, you just mentioned that was actually my original first question, which is, plug the important events coming up on July 8th to the 10th of this year, and talk about what it's all about. What can those who've paid a ticket or those who are interested expect, and any specific events and speakers you're particularly interested that folks should check out when they, those who have already signed up and those who I hope will sign up after watching this.
Yeah, so every year World Beyond War holds an annual No War conference. So this year is #NoWar 2022. And because of the pandemic, we did shift to a fully virtual conference. We used to kind of travel around. We had conferences in Washington, D.C. We had a conference in Ireland. We had one in Toronto in Canada. We would travel around and we would connect with activists in those regions and kind of shine an international light on something that was happening in that region. For example, in Ireland, we all kind of converged on Shannon Airport and were exposing the complicity of the Irish government and use how the U.S. military funnels troops and weapons through Shannon Airport in Ireland, and then they make their way on to the Middle East. So that was kind of the original model of the conference, was going to these different locations around the world. And then with the pandemic, we obviously had to completely shift. And we started doing a fully virtual conference. And it was actually really great. The silver lining is that we were able to have much more international participation. And last year we had people from 33 different countries part of the conference. We're hoping for something similar this year. Yeah. And so this year's theme is resistance and regeneration. And it's a really interesting theme because it combines basically this, what I call like the two-prong approach, which is one that we need to be, of course, opposing militarism, calling for disarmament, calling for divestment. But at the same time, we need that second piece of regeneration. What is the world going to look like? And I find, I've been doing organizing work for many years now, and I find that activists are often burned out, and you hear that activist burnout term. People are feeling depressed by the state of the world. And so we really wanted to have a conference theme that was nourishing and that was talking about these really amazing positive examples around the world of people who are both, shutting down a military base, but then also transforming the base site into like a peace park, or divesting their city from weapons, but then using that money to reinvest in positive things in their community. So there's lots of really interesting examples of kind of that duality and ways that people in the face of violence and war and conflict have been able to rise up and create these amazing kind of ecological and social justice communities.
That's fascinating. And Oh, if only I had the money, I would have definitely paid to to participate in it. And so yeah,
well, it is on a sliding scale. So we hope that that makes it accessible for people. And if it isn't, I mean, just contact me. We don't want finances to be a barrier to participation. So just get in touch with us. The website is worldbeyondwar.org/nowar2022. So there you can read the full schedule. And yeah, please do reach out to us if you're interested in attending.
Perfect. And then I have to ask this question, which is about feminism and warfare. Can you make the feminist case why feminists should be opposed to militarism? Because there's quite a lot of feminists that support World War I, and of course with Afghanistan, what's often used when people get into arguments why we should get out of Afghanistan is, well, look, the Taliban, this super patriarchal movement, is now in power again, and it's inflicting mass suffering on women. So what would you say to to those people and those who try to co-opt feminism to support militarism, like in Afghanistan, which is often marketed to us as the good war?
Yeah, well, this is actually a very timely question because in the United States recently there was legislation passed to expand the draft, which most people don't realize that the U.S. still has a draft.
The U.S. still has a draft?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, wow.
Does.
Okay, interesting.
It hasn't been, utilized in many decades, but when men turn 18, they have to sign up legally. You are legally required to sign up for the draft and provide your information. Most people don't realize that. So it could be called, the government could call on that whenever it wants. And so there was this whole argument similar to what you're saying of, in the name of equality, quote unquote, of expanding the draft to include women as well. And at World Beyond War, we were working with a number of organizations saying, no draft for anyone, abolish the draft, that it's not advancing equality to be forcing people to kill and murder and join the military. And unfortunately, we were unsuccessful in the campaign. So the draft was expanded and includes women. And it is sad to see that people are kind of celebrating that as somehow, advancing equality. And our argument is war is never the answer, that war just fuels, more violence, that, something like 90% of the victims of modern warfare are civilians. As we talked about, war destroys the environment. We could go on and on with all of the reasons. And we can make a counter argument that, if you're talking about Afghanistan, for example, or any country, instead of bombing them into submission, quote unquote, what if we used some of that money to provide them with food and healthcare and water and solar panels and, all these different needs. And then that would facilitate, international solidarity and much better diplomatic relationships. And instead, when we use force, when we use bombs to try to impose some kind of world order, it just leads to more destruction, and violence fuels violence. And we see the data that props that up. And we see even during, the war on terror, that numbers of terrorism were increasing, and there's stats that show that. And there's actually on our website, World Beyond War's website, we have all of these quotations from, for example, different Pentagon officials and various former military leaders who have openly stated, and you can look this up, that this is not working, that the use of drones, for example, is leading to what they call blowback and more terrorism. So for numerous reasons that we've touched on, we never see war as the answer to these solutions.
And there's during the George Floyd solidarity protests that happened in the U.S., Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and also across Europe, there are now vocal calls for defunding and abolishing the police. And what would you say to people who say that, we just need more women in the military, we need more queer people in the military? Yes, the military can be quite patriarchal, and of course it was a patriarchal, racist institution, but that you can reform the military by having more women and more queer folk And even though I'm of the opinion that the military is, militarism itself is very misogynistic, very, anti-queer, and of course, nakedly racist. Yeah. So what's your thoughts on that? And are there more, and amongst the different, people power movements in the U.S. are more starting to say that we actually should, if we are going to abolish the police, we also should abolish, the military and, the deep state, CIA and whatnot?
Yeah, well, to that question, we are trying to facilitate connections between the Black Lives Matter movement and sort of the anti-police movement and the anti-war movement. I would say there's still a lot of organizing work to be done to create that cross-movement connection. But at World Beyond War, you can look on our website. We have a campaign actually about demilitarizing the police. And that campaign is specifically making those linkages and talking about the fact that the police often receives military grade training and military grade weapons, often these surplus weapons from the Pentagon and the Department of Defense come back to haunt us, right? They come back to the people that supposedly these wars are being fought to protect, and now these surplus weapons,
our freedoms and all that stuff.
Right, supposedly. And then these weapons are coming back to our communities domestically as well. And, we're seeing hyper militarized police forces across the country. And so that's a campaign that we launched, I think, a few years ago. And David Swanson, who you interviewed, actually successfully demilitarized the police in Charlottesville, Virginia, where he lives. And that was a successful campaign through the city council to pass a resolution. And we're hoping that that will be a model for other cities and to start these conversations, connecting the dots between anti-police work and anti-war work. So I'm really glad you brought that up, because that is an ongoing campaign that we're working on. And I think to your broader question, there's so many facets. We've already touched on the environmental, the economic, etc. Another facet that we didn't even mention is just the efficacy of nonviolence. And there's really great data from Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, who researched 100 years of civil resistance movements and saw that nonviolence was actually more successful, twice as successful than violent civil resistance campaigns.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan. It's really excellent research. So there's so many facets that you can use to kind of counter the argument that we need more militarism. And I think as an organizer, my role, or one of the ways that we approach this, is to start with the expression of meet people where they're at. So have that conversation. If you are encountering someone who's pushing back and is pro-military, start that conversation and hear their concerns, meet them where they're at, and then kind of work from there. And maybe they're really concerned about the economy, maybe they're really concerned about the environment, and then you can kind of tie the issues together and try to address their concerns.
Yes, and if people want to abolish the police or go to a transition where we don't have the police being so neo-Dickensian and whatnot, I know that the military is basically the police on steroids. So so the whole stop and frisk, the punitive drug war and whatnot. Basically, the militarism and what the military does overseas is basically the police on steroids. So racial justice groups and other people power groups, social justice groups should really be part of the anti-war movement. But you were mentioning that the draft is actually still in place, and that's interesting because I always think that sometimes. What if the U.S. government and other governments actually had a mandatory draft like they had back then with World War I and the Vietnam War, and would that inflame more people to join anti-war groups and the peace movement, because everyone is always for militarism until they have to be the ones to actually join the military and be like humiliated and then go overseas in an unjust war. So yeah, what's your response to that? Because some people even said that as noble as the anti-war movement was in World War I and the Vietnam War, it would half of the hippies and so forth were just people who supported the war but just did not want themselves to participate, in the war efforts.
Yeah, I do hear that argument sometimes, but I wouldn't want to use, I don't know, I think it's a slippery slope. I wouldn't want to enforce the draft for the, to somehow think that maybe that would help the movement. Yeah, I wouldn't want to go there, but I think the larger point is how can we make militarism more tangible for people? And yes, as you're saying, when the Vietnam War was happening, it was right in American people's faces, and as you said, there was a personal risk. And now wars do feel so far off, and especially through the use of like drones, for example, it is much more distanced, and we're not also right. The media is not showing images of war the way it used to.
Yeah, it's way more censored, way more heavily censored than people give it credit for.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that that's really, the challenge and the opportunity for us in the anti-war movement is to make it visible, and we can make it visible in and tangible in all the ways that we've been discussing. Again, going back to figuring out what resonates for different communities, and then building in that cross connection. So if people are very concerned about the environment, which the climate change movement is very trendy, building those connections. If people are concerned about human rights, talking about that angle. So that is kind of our challenge, of course, the economic angle, and making people realize how much of their tax dollars are going towards war and how we could redirect this money. So, that is kind of our constant work as organizers, is using different messaging to try to appeal to people, to connect into their interests, and to really show, yes, war is still happening, and every single person is impacted because of all these multifaceted things that we're discussing. Even if you're not actively in a war zone, even if you're not drafted, you are still impacted or paying for war.
And that's a perfect segue to this one, which is the very thorny issue of the Russia-Ukraine war. And now, if you were invited to speak at a school or corporate media or the Democracy Now's or Pacifica's of the world, how do you explain how this war broke out, and that if one really wants to stand with Ukraine, then we shouldn't escalate the war. We should not be expanding NATO. We also shouldn't allow NATO to exist. And even if one does condemn the actions of the Putin government, this conflict didn't start with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It started with the Euromaidan Western-backed coup against Viktor Yanukovych, and and all the events of that. So how would you explain Ukraine to people who have this knee-jerk reaction, stand with Ukraine, rah rah rah, NATO is good, and Putin is is Satan incarnate, and we need to bring the war to him as opposed to him bringing the war to to us?
Yeah, well, definitely the Ukraine crisis has made war a lot more visible. And in some ways that is not a good, and I don't want to say good thing, but it has kind of helped us to bring war into the conversation more. Like the mainstream media is talking about war more. And so I think this is an opportunity for us that we have to utilize as the anti-war movement to get our messaging into the conversation. Certainly the mainstream media is, as you said, very pro-war right now, but the fact that war is even, being talked about, and the impacts of war, like the refugee crisis coming out of Ukraine, is really being highlighted. Groups are really responding to that. So this is our opportunity, and World Beyond War, we've been trying to come in and say, see, you can see what's happening. This is what has been happening for decades with U.S. wars. Let's not forget about the ongoing war in Yemen. Let's not forget about the ongoing crisis in Afghanistan. Let's not forget about the drone attacks on Somalia that the U.S. is still doing. And let's not forget about what Israel is doing to Palestine. So we're using this as an opportunity to kind of broaden the conversation now that people are paying attention to war for the first time and talking about the larger context. We can visibly see these horrific things happening in Ukraine, and we can use that to show this is what's happening. This is what your tax dollars have been paying for decades for U.S. imperialist wars. And I have to point people to our board member, World Beyond War's board member, Youri, who is based in Kyiv. He is doing incredible work. He is a conscientious objector. He opposes being in the military, and he is totally nonviolent and anti-war in his approach, despite being in the midst of an ongoing conflict in Kyiv.
Yeah.
And we have been able to maintain communication with him throughout this entire conflict. He's been featured on Democracy Now! Several times. So I would really point people to listen to his interviews on Democracy Now!, where he really speaks from a firsthand perspective as a Ukrainian and talks about why war is not the answer, and why, NATO is not the answer, and nor is Russia's invasion the answer, but really that we need negotiations, and we need a ceasefire, and we need a peace agreement, and the end to NATO, and de-escalation. And we've been, of course, opposing Russia's invasion and also opposing the West just funneling billions of dollars of weapons into the conflict, Canada and the US. And we just see that as, fanning the flames of war, leading to more civilian deaths and not resolving the issue.
And two quick follow-ups to that is what do you say to some of us on the in the anti-imperialist movement who do condemn in a way Russia's response to NATO military buildup, the the coup that took place in Ukraine that saw the ultra neo-Nazis get into power. What would you say to those who say that who say, hey, I'm not for war, but Russia was provoked into this conflict, and Russia exhausted all of its diplomatic means, and ergo, Russia was right to respond militarily to Ukraine and its Western backers?
Yeah, well, at World Beyond War, we have a very sort of principled stance. So for us, war is never the answer, as we've been talking about. There's so many other possibilities, whether, ceasefires, negotiations, targeted sanctions, and I say targeted specifically, not sanctions against a whole population.
Exactly, sanctions, collective punishment, which, going back to the feminist thing, impacts mostly, women and children.
Right. So not the way sanctions are currently imposed, but there are ways to do more targeted sanctions that don't impact populations. There are so many sort of tools in our toolbox. And again, we see how modern warfare disproportionately impacts civilians. And we talked about the efficacy of nonviolence that we've seen through the research from Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan. So for us, we never go to a violent solution. We never think violence is the answer. And so I would just emphasize that point. And even, when Russia started the invasion, there was a lot of messaging about, well, it's going to be very quick. It's going to be just targeted to the military infrastructure. We'll get in, get out, and that's not what we've seen. This is dragging on for months. We're seeing civilian casualties. We're seeing massive destruction of civilian infrastructure. So I just think that that's a false narrative of, well, we can be very targeted and we can do this in, the perfect way. And it gets messy, and that's not the reality of the situation.
And you mentioned Youri from Ukraine and his small organization that's trying to stop this war non-violently and bring Western Ukrainians and Eastern Ukrainians together, as well as detente with Russia. I'm just out of curiosity, is World Beyond War in touch with anyone in Russia that's part of a similar organization, the one like Youri is in, and what's been their then what's been their perspective on why this conflict broke out and the government's actions?
I haven't personally been in communication with people from Russia, but I know that many of my colleagues do have connections, so I can't necessarily speak for them. But I mean, I do recall when the conflict first broke out, you probably saw the images and videos of hundreds of thousands of Russian people protesting in the streets. I think the petition had, hundreds of thousands of signatures within days of the conflict breaking out. So we really did see nonviolent civil resistance from Russians as well, opposing a military solution. So that was really amazing to see, and we've been trying to amplify that work as well.
Perfect. And I'm almost done. And one question then another question that I have to ask then is what do you think it's going to take for people to realize that that even if you think that a war is just, war should not be the response, because my problem with Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that there's already been this very irrational anti-Russia hysteria. And even if some people in the region of Eastern Europe do have legitimate grievances towards Russia, whether it was Tsarist Russia or communist Russia or capitalist Russia, but that Putin's actions is only going to make those ultra nationalist movements in the region much more powerful. It's only going to further make people think that NATO is a force for good in the world. And so what do you think what do you think it's going to take for people to realize that no, wars should never be the solution, even if you agree with the resistance of Yemenis, Syrians, Iraqis, Palestinians, and Russia against the Western imperialists?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for me, at World Beyond War, we often bring it back to talking about who is the biggest culprit, who is the biggest player here, and that's the U.S. military. And so when people kind of use this argument of, well, we have to have war because we need to defend ourselves against the boogeymen, China and Russia and Iran, it's really important to look at the proportionality and to make the comparisons here, and to look at the fact that the U.S. military budget is 50% of all global military spending is just the United States, and to see that the U.S. is 95% of all foreign military bases. Yeah. And just, when you look at the numbers, the U.S. is just off the charts compared to the other countries. So I think that it kind of falls apart in my mind when people make the argument that we need war and we need a militarized response to protect ourselves, when we're the biggest warmongers, are the U.S. government. And so I think that if we want to lead the way towards a nonviolent culture of peace, the U.S. needs to be a leader, and the U.S. needs to show and lead this example of de-escalation and basically lead a reverse arms race. And I think if the U.S. can start to do that, if we can start to slowly close those foreign military bases, if we can start to slowly chip away at the military budget, then other countries will respond in kind.
Plus the nuclear ones.
Yeah, and I think then other countries will start to respond in kind, because right now, yeah, countries are escalating in response to what they're seeing as this, imperialist threat of the U.S. circling these countries with military bases. So that's our approach at World Beyond War, and that's why we oppose militarism from every country, but we do especially have a lot of fact sheets and information about the U.S. military to shine a light on that, the biggest culprit here, and to have a global movement. It can't just be in the U.S. It has to be a global movement of everyone around the world who is impacted by militarism calling for this de-escalation.
Yeah, and going back to the climate crisis, wars are also, these wars for oil, these, and these, these endless imperial wars. It's also so counterproductive, because given that, with the new Cold War on China, the pivot to Asia, and this Cold War with Russia, which has officially gone to a hot war and de facto World War III with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and NATO, expansion. When we talk about the climate crisis, it's just so counterproductive, because because instead of Russia, China, and the United States and Canada and its allies all working together to solve the climate crisis and stop all of these ridiculous wars for oil and mining and gold and whatnot, it's we're weakening the peace movements there, we're weakening the climate justice movements in China and Russia and so forth, because of these ridiculous imperial blind spots we have, and the fact that as you mentioned, the U.S. is the leading militarist that's destroying the Earth's lungs and heart, right?
Yeah. As we said, the U.S. military is the largest institutional consumer of oil on the planet, and all of the funding, in the U.S., $1 trillion a year goes to the military. So all of that could be spent on so many other things: solar panels, wind, a just transition for workers, etc. Yeah, well, I want to kind of bring us back to our upcoming event, as we talked about it at the start, No War 2022 Resistance and Regeneration, which is happening July 8 through 10. So if you're interested in all the things that we've been talking about, I hope people can join us for the conference. As I said, it is fully virtual this year, and it really touches on a lot of these themes. And again, kind of looking at the intersections, the impact of war on the climate, the impact of war on the refugee crisis, the connections between the wars and the police, and everything we've been talking about. Youri from Ukraine is doing an opening welcome address as part of the conference as well, to give us an update from what's happening in Ukraine. And again, I think this event is really unique because if people are feeling depressed by all of the topics that we're saying, we're going to be sharing some really positive examples of people around the world. For example, refugees from Afghanistan who have started doing permaculture and farming and regenerating in their community, and what that can look like even amidst, a very, very challenging, violent situation. So I hope that it leaves people feeling inspired and hopeful. And again, you can go to worldbeyondwar.org/nowar2022 to learn more, and hopefully see you guys at the event.
And just before I let you go, very quickly, although I hate that we have to be very, brief about this important topic, but the plight of Native Americans. I'm wondering, when do you think in the United States the plight of Native Americans will be as big a topic as it is in Canada? Or if we talk about topics in the U.S. like, imperialism, Black Lives Matter, the anti-police brutality movement, when do you think the criminally overlooked plight of Native Americans and that ongoing racist, imperialist, white supremacist, climate, apartheid war is going to finally be a major topic amongst the peace movement and the anti-war movements in the U.S., like Palestine or and all those other important topics that we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, at World Beyond War, we've talked about throughout how intersectionality is really important for us, and making these cross connections between all these different movements. So we've been trying to do that as well with the Indigenous rights movement, and talk about how militarism, disproportionately impacts Indigenous people, disproportionately impacts people of color. And for example, our Canada organizer, Rachel Small, spent several weeks in the Wet'suwet'en territory in so-called Canada, where the Wet'suwet'en peoples are opposing the construction of a fossil fuel pipeline. They've been opposing various pipeline projects for years, and they have an amazing resistance camp that they've set up. It's all nonviolent resistance with a quite brutal police response. There have been massive protests across Canada and across the world in support of the Wet'suwet'en peoples. So that is something that, we sent Rachel off there to spend time with the Wet'suwet'en community and to show our solidarity and to connect the dots between these issues. And I think that really, for me, emphasizes the importance of the global movement. So we can really show how the struggle is the same from Wet'suwet'en to Palestine to Colombia, to Ukraine, all around the world. The struggle is at the core the same, a struggle for self-determination, a struggle for justice, for a clean environment, all the things that people want to thrive in community with each other. And so that, to me, is actually what inspires me about working for World Beyond War, is to be able to connect with all these communities around the world and have this international solidarity together.
Well, if you guys ever open up, a special branch which is related to, the plight of Native Americans and having them be, leaders in the anti-war movement, do let me know. And then just before I let Greta go, it's time for the questionnaire. We usually end the program with the James Lipton questionnaire. So Greta, it's your turn to do it. So very quickly, what is your favorite words?
Well, favorite word. I guess I'll say regeneration, because that word has been really on my mind with the conference, and I think it really encapsulates, basically my life's work with the World Beyond War and with the farm.
What's your least favorite word then?
Oh, least favorite word. I don't know. This is a tough one.
Probably war, right? Or
sure, we'll go with war.
Then what turns you on spiritually, emotionally, or artistically? What inspires you?
Yeah, I guess for me, I'm inspired in my day-to-day work. Just, I get to receive all these emails from activists around the world, and just, all these people who want to make a difference, and they reach out to us and say, how can I help? And the same thing with our farm. As I said, we have a program for young people that come and live on the farm, and we get many, many applications each year, many more than we can accommodate. We had 150 applications so far this year for people who want to come live on the farm. And so just the fact that basically across these different issues, there is a movement of people who are interested and passionate about making change, and that keeps me going.
And then what turns you off?
Well, I guess it, connects a little bit earlier to what we were saying about activist burnout. And, I guess the flip side is that this work can be really challenging. It can be depressing at times. These campaigns, abolishing war is, a lifetime's work. And so I think for me and for many activists, it's important to make time for self-care. And sometimes, of course, I can get overworked and get stressed out. And so trying to find balance is the life struggle.
And then what sound or noise do you love, followed by what sound or noise do you hate?
A sound or noise?
That you love, and then one that you hate.
Well, I hate the sound of gunshots, which we live in a rural area.
Very timely.
Yeah, it's quite incredible because, we live in an area where people hunt, and just hearing that noise, it's just, when I think of that and then, try to put myself in a war zone, I can't even imagine. Like, just hearing one hunting gun is like shocking, and then just to imagine the scale of a war zone. So that is a very shocking noise. And then I guess the flip side, a positive, would be the birds. We have a lot of birds here on the farm, and sometimes when I do,
that was actually David's response. Is that
really?
Sound of birds.
Yeah. Well, sometimes when I do Zoom calls, people say they can hear the birds coming through the phone. So that it's quite magical to be in an environment like that.
Then what's your favorite curse word? And yes, you can curse on this program.
I actually don't curse. Yeah, that's something unique about me.
Really?
Yes.
No. Okay, wow, interesting. Is there a particular curse word that you do like hearing, or out of other people's mouths, of course, or?
I don't know. That's maybe it's just an inherent sort of pacifism that I have. But even as a child, I always was very turned off by curse words.
Okay, interesting. And then, what profession, if you weren't doing the peace work you do and the environmentalism, and in the garden, so what profession, if you weren't doing yours, would you love to do?
I would probably do something like being a nutritionist or a fitness trainer or something like that, which is a career path that I was kind of thinking about. Another way of making change, but I guess more of a almost direct service kind of hands-on, on the ground change.
Oh, perfect. And then what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Working for Raytheon or Goldman Sachs.
Great answer. And then the final one: if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly, pearly gates, or whatever is the vision of heaven that you believe or don't believe in?
I've never thought of that. I guess just something along the lines of, you are welcome here, you are safe, and all is well.
All right. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Greta Zarro, the organizing director of World Beyond War. And and then Greta, remind us again the dates, how people can get tickets, or if they don't have the financial means, what they can do to check out the event.
Yes, so it's worldbeyondwar.org/NoWar2022. It's the No War 2022 conference titled Resistance and Regeneration, which is coming up on July 8 through 10. You can go to the website, look at the schedule. If you represent an organization, organizations can also endorse the event and help promote it. We also have sponsorship available, so organizations can get booths. And again, it is all virtual, but we'll have like expo booths so people can visit different booths and check out organizations. And yeah, just get in touch with us if you're interested in attending.
Perfect. Well, Greta, it was an honor to have you on the program. I hope we have you on many times more in the future. Best of luck with the event, and you give all my love to David, Rachel Small, the entire World Beyond War team. And thank you so much for coming on. Oh, and folks, don't forget, if you're in Toronto, Danforth, vote for Jennifer Moxon of the Communist Party of Canada, and do visit the links that I'm going to post, especially the ones with my friend Fiona, and help her family rebuild after the sickening xenophobic attack that they had. So Greta, thank you so much, and best of luck with everything.
Thanks so much. Have a good one.